Good morning. It's about 10 o'clock and this is episode 1540 of the series. Yes, we are progressing quickly here. And now well into one of the greatest 20th century philosopher, Jacques Derrida, whom we had let a lot of time recently, through the whole series. And now he is going to deconstruct biology. And I will start with some quotations and some paragraphs from this book, Biodeconstruction, Jacques Derrida and the Life Sciences. It is written by Francesco Vitale, put together by Francesco Vitale, and translated by Mauro Senatore. I would like to go to an excerpt from Life, Death by Jacques Derrida, put together, edited by Pascale Anna Rolt and Peggy Camuff from 2020. I will read this from the last paragraph on page 30. The deconstruction of life between Hegel and Jacob. Derrida inaugurates the seminar with an explanation of the title, that is, of the choice of leaving the relationship between life and death undetermined. Quote, "What did I do in announcing this seminar under the title La vie, la mort? That is, replacing with a hyphen or with a spacing without trait, with a marked silence. The and that usually posits death with life as juxtaposed, or more properly, opposed to life. The relation of juxtaposition or opposition, the relation of positing, the logic of positing. This will be perhaps what precisely comes into question with life, death. In removing the and, I didn't mean to suggest that life and death are not two, or that they are not each the other's other. but that this alterity or difference is not of the order of what philosophy calls opposition. Double position of two facing each other. Like in Hegel, for instance, where the concept of position and the position of the concept, autoposition, and opposition form the motor schemas of dialectics, and of dialectics that affirm itself essentially as a very powerful thinking of life and death, of what we call the relations of life and death, and above all, where opposition, contradiction, whether dialectical or not, is the process of the transition of an opposite into the other, of the identification sublating the one into the other. The stakes of the seminar are evident. Freeing the thought of life and death, of the relationship, of the border that separates and holds them together, from the legacy of tradition, and thus, above all, from the logic of the hierarchically oriented oppositions that for Derrida structures the Western philosophical tradition as a metaphysics. In Positions, which is from only a few years before the seminar, while describing the general strategy of deconstruction, Derrida affirms the necessity of overturning this hierarchy. Quote, "What interested me then, that I am attempting to pursue along other lines now, was at the same time as a general economy, a kind of general strategy of deconstruction. The latter is to avoid both simply neutralizing the binary oppositions of metaphysics and simply residing within the close field of these oppositions, thereby confirming it. Therefore, we must proceed using a double gesture, according to a unity that is both systematic and in and of itself divided. A double writing that is a writing that is in and of itself multiple. What I called in La Double Science a double science. On the one hand, we must traverse a phase of overturning. To do justice to this necessity is to recognize that in a classical philosophical opposition, we are not dealing with a peaceful coexistence of a vis-à-vis, but rather with a violent hierarchy. One of the two terms governs the other, axiologically, logically, etc., or has the upper hand. To deconstruct the opposition, first of all, is to overturn the hierarchy at a given moment. To overlook this phase of overturning is to forget the conflictual and subordinating structure of oppositions. My comment here, we can also see it as two different chiralities. And why not the dominant right hand as we have today compared to the left hand? Or left turn compared to right turn in the universe. End of quote. However, he also points out that deconstruction does not limit itself to the simple overturning of hierarchy, which would leave unaltered the field of intervention, as well as the system of oppositions that structures that field. The effectiveness of deconstruction hinges on the introduction of a notion that destabilizes the metaphysical oppositions from within, in order to account for the differential/differing relationship as the irreducible condition of the constitution of the terms that are merely understood as opposed. we have a difference in time, differ, and difference, a different in space. Quote again here. To set to work within the text of the history of philosophy, as well as within the so-called literary text, certain marks, shall we say, I have called undecidables, that is, unities of simulacrum, false verbal properties that can no longer be included within philosophical opposition, but which, however, inhabit philosophical oppositions, resisting and disorganizing it, without ever constituting a third term, without ever leaving room for a solution in the form of speculative dialectics. I will read the parenthesis. The pharmakon, an example of these false verbal properties, is neither remedy nor poison, neither good nor evil, neither the inside nor the outside, neither speech nor writing. The supplement is neither a plus nor a minus, neither an outside nor the complement of an inside, neither accident nor essence. The gram is neither a signifier nor a signified, neither a sign nor a thing, neither presence nor absence, neither a position nor a negation, neither nor, that is simultaneously either or. The mark is also the marginal limit, the march, etc. End of quote. For what concerns us here, this means that on the one hand, the interest in death, which many interpreters assume as the dominant trait of Derrida's thought, think, for instance, of Roberto Esposito, who grounds on his assumption the alleged overcoming of deconstruction through biopolitics. only consists in a preliminary moment, the overturning of hierarchy. On the other hand, with life, death, Derrida prepares the ground for the introduction of a notion to which the deconstructive effects of his discourse are bound. Life, death, life and death, neither life nor death, as long as they are considered by themselves, and thus the one opposed to the other. Recalling the interview, Learning to Live finally, that I quoted at the beginning of the book, I advance the following hypothesis. Here, Derrida lays the premises for the question of survival, survie, or survivance, to which the bearing of deconstruction of the traditional notion of life is linked far beyond the seminar. Within these general coordinates, which orient deconstruction itself, in the opening scene of the seminar, Derrida establishes in greater detail the textual coordinates that orient the attempt to elaborate a new thought of the relationship between life and death. The first coordinate, namely Hegel, was already evident and, in any case, unavoidable. In insisting, quote here, on the necessity of beginning with this kind of questions, with logical questions, if you like, in wondering whether the whole positional and oppositional logic, in which the limit life/death has been and still is thought, not only is not powerful enough to think this limit, but is itself produced as an effect of life, death, and thus must be reread as logic in general from this point of view. I'm pointing to two textual indicators that seem to me to impose themselves today. On the one hand, Hegel, and above all, Hegel's logic. End of quote. Therefore, the seminar begins under the aegis of Hegel, whose authority consists in giving the most accomplished formulation of the philosophical concept of life. It is with Hegel that we must engage in order to formulate a new concept of life. A concept liberated from the metaphysical propositions that, to begin with, the opposition between life and death could silently influence again the life sciences. This is what is at stake in contemporary biology, which aims to demarcate itself from philosophy, as well in the deconstruction of the concept of life. It is not by chance that François Jacob, who is considered an influential representative of this process of demarcation, stand for the second textual indicator. Good. On the other hand, another textual indicator that I will call the logic of living, using the title of Jacob's book, today tends to decipher the living through the whole problematics of message, code, or even genetic text. In order to distance themselves from what they consider a bit too quickly the hypostatizing and substantialist compulsion of the philosopher, omitting, for instance, that Hegel demonstrates the necessity to go through the living individual as a necessary position within the syllogism of life, with the judgment, Urteil, of life that originally splits it off to produce and reproduce itself, and modernity then, that aims to decipher the living as a language that depends on logic, Between these two textual indicators lies the field in which we will be situated here. End of quote. And my comment here, this is acutely pointing to the difference that is made nowadays, where usually life is coming from dead material. The opposition is quite stark today. In The Logic of Life, Jacob rethinks the history through which biology came to understand the mechanisms of genetic heritage, to discover all the essential role that DNA plays in the production of the cell, and thus the elementary unity of the life of the living, of all livings. Thanks to this discovery, biology could elaborate the logic that regulates the life of the living within the framework of the theory of evolution, namely the logic of the reproduction or self-reproduction of the living, which, as Derrida remarks, Hegel had already considered the key for the understanding of the living. The theory of organized systems elaborated by cybernetics gave an essential contribution to the discovery of the logic of the living. Jacob also mentions Wiener, and like Leroy-Gourand, recalls the analogy between machines and living forms. But he goes further. Is it possible to apply cybernetics not only to the behavior of the animals, which are already organized with respect to the environment, but also to the mechanisms of genetic heredity, and thus to the most elementary laws that regulate the formation of the living. Quote, organs, cells, and molecules are thus united by a communication network. They constantly exchange signals and messages. In the form of specific interactions between constituents. The flexibility of behavior depends on feedback loops. The rigidity of structures on the execution of a program rigorously laid down. Heredity becomes the transfer of a message repeated from one generation to the next. The programs of the structures to be produced are recorded in the nucleus of the egg. The plan of the organism is mapped out by a combinative system of chemical symbols. Heredity functions like the memory of a computer. The motifs or discrete traits that play as the letters of the alphabet are the four elements of which the structure of DNA consists. It is a long polymer formed by the alignment of four subunits. The four organic bases, repeated by millions and permutated along the chain, like the letters of the alphabet in a text. It is the order of these four subunits that directs the order of the 20 subunits in proteins. Everything then leads one to regard the sequence contained in genetic material as a series of instructions specifying molecular structures, and hence the properties of the cell. To consider the plan of an organism as a message transmitted from generation to generation. My comment here, it's very close to the deconstruction made by the biologist Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana. Francisco Varela wrote a book called The Tree of Life, or The Tree of Knowledge, showing that difference, so to say, is the composited ingredients, like the DNA of all understanding. Therefore, on the one hand, Hegel is the representative of the philosophical determination of life. And on the other, Jacob is the representative of the life sciences, and in particular of the emancipation of biology from philosophy, which would take place by grafting cybernetics onto the field of biology. On the one hand, through Hegel, Derrida deconstructs the metaphysical determination of life, grounded on the life-death opposition. On the other, through Jacob, he verifies the deconstructive effects of the recourse to the theory of information, and in particular to the notions of program and writing in the context of the life sciences. It is worth noting, it is worth remarking, however, from the first pages, Derrida seems to be very suspicious about the alleged emancipation of biology from philosophy, at least for what concerns Jacob. It is precisely to the latter that Derrida refers between parentheses. Indeed, it is Jacob himself who justifies the choice of the title, The Logic of Life, with the purpose of avoiding the hypostatization of life as an abstract metaphysical entity, and thus it is Jacob that Derrida recalls the analogous position of Hegel, who takes the living as a concrete point of departure for the reconstruction of the logic that would be proper of the living itself. A very important sentence here. Directly take it out. Who takes the living as the concrete point of departure for the reconstruction of the logic that would be the proper of the living itself. It seems that Derrida wishes to highlight a problem that has existed since the beginning, through the life-death opposition, the unconscious legacy of philosophy and metaphysics still affects modern biology, which, however, supposes to be liberated and thus risks neutralizing the innovations that the importation of cybernetics seem to enable. In the introduction to the seminar, Derrida argues that not only the Hegelian system, but the entire philosophical tradition, of which the former aims to be sublating accomplishment, Aufhebung, would be constructed in order to protect itself through the repression of another logic of the living. A logic according to which the relationship between life and death would no longer respond to the scheme of the oppositional logic of metaphysics, by which life is being and death is non-being. Therefore, the syntagm life-death points to another thought of life that would finally be able to account for another relationship between life and death, as well as for the reasons that led thought to repress this relationship, to hide it through the imposition of the opposition between life and death. Quote here, by merely alluding to it at the outset, I wanted to mark three things. On the one hand, that the and of juxtaposition should not only be interrogated and thus suspended, while we wonder whether the relations of being and death really do come under what is called opposition or contradiction, but more radically, if what is comprehended under the concept of opposition of juxtaposition, dialectical scheme, as if I can only use the as if here because I neither want nor can oppose a logic to the logic of opposition. As if the whole logic of opposition were a ruse put forward by life, death, in order to dissimulate, guard, hide, host, forget something. What? Something that in any case neither posits itself nor is opposed any longer, and that would no longer be something in the sense of position. So I end the reading there, just before the next.
Page
36. I will start with the fourth session of Life, Death, Jacques Derrida, the logic of the supplement, as we mentioned earlier, the supplement of the other, of death, of meaning, of life. I will just begin. What is apparently the most readable in the text of modern biologists regarding his own science, in the text that the modern biologist writes, at once a scientist as epistemologist of his science, as historian of his science, as philosopher of his science. What is apparently most readable in this text of the modern biologist or geneticist is that he does not write a text on something that would be outside the text. Something that would be textual, that would form a referent whose nature would be foreign in its being or in its structure to textuality, but quite to the contrary. He writes a text on a text, a text on a text, in order to demonstrate, recall, or write that his object has the structure of text. And that there is no longer anything in the object of his science or of his research, nothing as a scientific object that is metatextual. So there is nothing as a scientific object that is metatextual. My point in saying this is not to recall this mundane fact that the biologist or the geneticist has to refer, as he does indeed have to refer. For this is indispensable to scientific writings, to archive of genetic science that is either out of date or current, an archive without which science would not be possible. But also more radically, that his ultimate referent, the living, along with the productive, reproductive structure of the living, is now analyzed as text. In constitution is that of a text, and the emergence of scientific modernity in the genetical biological domain consists, it seems, in this mutation by which science, by which knowledge is no longer the production of text on the subject of an object that in itself would be, as a referent of this knowledge, metatextual, but that is itself textual in its structure. So it's part of the text, it's not over or beyond, transcendental of the text. what could have appeared more or less naively to be the limited condition of philology, of literary criticism, of the science of documents and archives, etc., namely having as its ultimate referring something that we used to call text, and that we believed we understood under this name. This condition is now shared by genetics or the science of the living in general. And if the science of the living is not a science among others, but the science that is presupposed by all the sciences that determine their objects in field involving the living, for instance, psychoanalysis, history. If then the science of the living is not a science among others, it's textualizing. The textualization of its object and of its subject leaves nothing outside of it. This obviously does not lead to the claim, as one might be able to assert, with a more or less interested or interesting naivete, that everything is now going to be, as a result of this textualization, restricted to the safe confines of a book, of a notebook, or of a more or less specialized library. It leads, on the contrary, to an extremely violent reinterpretation of the limit between this inside and its outside. So inside, outside, and or, if you like, applying a decisive role in both these texts. Derrida is establishing that our usual mode of prioritizing and marginalizing is constructing an unjust difference, if you like, a non-informative difference. And that is behind the idea of not opposing the pair, but instead leaving a space in between them. And we mentioned that the other day. It's called the caesura. It makes for the rhythm of reading and the rhythm of life. It's not to be interpreted as either or and or. It's inclusive of all. This second reading here shows that there's nothing beyond the text, meaning the subject and object. And as in quantum mechanics, the observer and the observed are on the same level. The meta level, or the transcendence, the tegmarchian otherworldly, does not acknowledge the order, that it is me who chooses what is first. Even within the Hegelian logic, and especially in the later classical logic, it has been made axiomatic. Call the axiom of choice, the AC. So even choice seemed to be an opposition of sorts. I put a little pause there, and there will be a summary and questions. So I will try to make a summary, which will in itself be, of course, very tough. These texts are expanding over a great area. But the zest of it, to make a very, very short abstract, is that Derrida would want to deconstruct something that biology can sort of by itself seep into, or dig itself into a sort of a trench. You can imagine the trenches in the Great War opposing each other. The German trench versus the British trench. They are digged in, and thereby merely, and I say this is very important, only opposing each other. It's nothing inherently bad with opposing, but it's more the only that is problematic. Therefore it was good with the repetition here of the differing relationship, as we saw at page 32, with the pharmakon, which is neither a remedy nor a poison, neither good nor evil, neither the inside nor the outside. By opposing or digging into the trenches, we know already in this series we come into problems. In the philosophy of consciousness, we have what is the dominating veneer of making an absolute cut. So even life itself is consisting of death today, of atoms, molecules. Out of death comes life, in this case, in a very oppositional way. And as we know, that has led to intractable problems and paradoxes, especially the heart problem, and also problems with DNA, we mentioned a couple of times, which was automatically deconstructed by biology itself, and the Craig Venter scandal, if you like. Here we use simulacrum or simulacrae to dwell deeper, and adding not only opposition but also letting them be different. So if we look at that, we begin with life/death. This is similar to the trenches I mentioned earlier. And it leads to stasis, as I depict in this model. And I took the liberty to use the initials D and L, standing for death and life, but also for right and left, remember that, because the life/death is timeless. The two things are existing simultaneously. There is no time, there is no space. Difference brings this healthiness to it. It differs in space and it differs in time, as it is constructed of differ and difference. And all of a sudden we get life, death, which I put in green for the living color. We were lucky enough to find a really strident green pen, thanks to my colleague Kalle here. It is strong. Death, life, in the stasis becomes life, death. Now it can live. And exactly the same signs are used in quantum mechanics, physics, chemistry, and also biology, very fitting. And here they stand for right and left, using the D. It's related to dexterity, if I remember correctly, dexterity. Those we know, as we talked the other day with Stefan Mangold, are the building blocks of life. One is healthy different from the other because it's chirally opposed. And it builds a force, a life force, thanks to them being able to actively be different, not like this stalemate. So deaf life is already, at least with the acronyms, participating in the life spiral. And during the course of this extensive lecture series, we are just going to mention a few, but we have Heraclitus, who shocked people, and people, some people, my ex-teacher used to think he was a death wisher, or he was some sort of depressed guy. It's far from the point. It's actually the living itself, which is a movement and has time, it has space. Another one is Heidegger. In Heidegger, we have the healthy relationship between aletheia and theia. An unhealthy relationship could be like this, close to this. But they are two D and L, as in the life structure or the force structure, that gives a direction. And we know that the communication network of organ cells and molecules, as we read on page 34, last paragraph, these structures are a unity and also completely different. They are records of things in the DNA, but they are also the product of something, which fits neatly because one of these things, the D, is the product of life, like sugars, what we leave after us. lactic acid is a very good example, which comes into our muscles when we do something with effort. L is life itself, the left-handedness. This seems to be the clue to what makes force work. The very opposition, so to speak, in a more temporal and spaceful way. When they can dance together. And I quote from page 35, an example of Hegel, who's quite good here, who takes the living as a concrete point of departure for the reconstruction of the logic that will be proper of the living itself, in a sublating accomplishment of Hegel. And not in the order of repression of another logic of the living. A logic according to which the relationship between life and death would no longer respond to the scheme of the oppositional logic of metaphysics, by which, listen now, life is being and death is non-being. No, this one takes timelessness and spacelessness. It's the stalemate. It is the non-living structure. The juxtaposition expands in this, and the aletheia and the theia becomes healthy participators in being. Something that also is said by Jesus. There is life in death and death in life. He shows with the resurrection, for instance, that out of death comes life, and it's in this way quite literally. Yeah, maybe a comment here before I progress. Put this on you here. Just wait until I get the
erase.
You
can put a pause there.
Okay. Put a pause. We continue here with Kalle Lundahl.
Yes. Here I have a quotation from the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 7. Ho hagios, that is the Holy One, and ho alethinos, the truth, and the one who speaks the truth. This is about Jesus. Ho hagios, ho alethinos, the Holy One, and the one who speaks the truth, who has the key of David, ho echon tein David, who opens ho anoikon, and no one will be able to close. The thing that he opens, nobody can close it, and so forth. And why am I interested in this passage in relation to our topic, life and death? Because David, King David, is in this context represents life. We know that from a passage verse in the book of Revelation, he represents life, authority over life, whatever he does, whatever he opens, nobody will close it. But we have also a manuscript. Instead of David, the key of David, we have the key of Hades. And here you have more clearly the opposition between life and death, Hades. And I would like to read a text from Archbishop Andrea of Caesarea, a 7th century commentary, very important patristic. Thanks to this commentary, so the modern scholar Eugenia Scarvelis Constantinou comments in the early 7th century, the most important Greek patristic commentary on the book of Revelation was produced by Andrew, Archbishop of Caesarea Cappadocia. Its impact on the user understanding of the apocalypse in Eastern Christianity would be enduring and unparalleled. It directly led to the ultimate reception of revelation into the New Testament canon of the Orthodox Church. So Andrew Caesarea's commentary is hugely important. And he writes about this verse. His kingdom, that is Jesus' kingdom, is called the key of David. That is the key of David. For it is the symbol of authority. The key is also the Holy Spirit, the key of both the book of Psalms and every prophecy, through which the treasures of knowledge are opened. On the other hand, he receives the first according to his humanity, and on the other hand, he possesses the second according to the beginninglessness of his divinity. Since in some manuscripts, Hades is written instead of David, this would mean that through the key of Hades, the authority over life and death has been confirmed in Christ. He is holy and true, as absolute holiness and self-existent truth. In quotation. So what I love about Andrew Caesare's commentary is that he doesn't do what modern scholars do. What does the modern scholars do? They place this reading in the footnote, in the textual apparatus. You can find this reading, for instance, in a manuscript in Madrid. This is the name of the Madrid, the Royal Imperial Palazzo outside of Madrid. The Escorial. You have the manuscript actually there, which reads to Haru. So they marginalize this reading because this reading is very late, in late manuscripts. Relatively late, but he's writing in the 7th century. So it's not too late. He, on the other hand, he establishes a smooth relationship between these two readings. And I like this smoothness in among modern scholars. They make these rough oppositions. They put this in the footnotes. And most often they don't even comment on it, because it's only late in some manuscripts. Andrew Caesare, he said he is able to say something edifying of relating to both variants. And this is my model, Andrew Caesare, in this case. And also Jacques Derrida, he says he called these seminars life, death, without a slash, or without a parenthesis, or without a hyphen. But anyhow, so the question is, if I would be the editor, or if you were the editor of the Greek New Testament, how would you edit the text? Of course, you have to make an editorial choice. It's a tricky question, and I have been struggling with this the last week. So let's see if we can arrive at a common solution. One is to, so let's say let's say that we have here the running text. You have the key of David. Claim David. Let's imagine that you are Jacques Derrida. Or we were Jacques Derrida. How would he do this?
Thank you.
Let's imagine this. So you have the problem that this is in only some manuscripts, late manuscripts. How would you do it? How would you print it? Because we know editor, you have to make a choice how to make the layout. Should you place this in the footnote or keep it? Andrew, as said, he was able to incorporate both in his commentary. But commentary is not the same as Greek text, a smooth text. I can show this how it looks like. This is a scientific commentary. Are you able to see it? You see here, Ho Alecinos, Ho Echon Kleien, David. You see. Then further down you have it, Johannu, I don't know if when it's a small letter somewhere. It's even lost completely. This to David, Tuadu you see there, Tuadu. Small, very small. 2050 it stands for the number of the manuscript, and that manuscript is in Madrid. But Andrew Cesaria had some manuscripts, so there must be more than one manuscript. So you have to make a choice. How would you print this in the text? It's a tricky question. On one hand, it would be tempting. This is the definite article. We don't need it now here, because you can also place the definite article here in front of David, which you have in some manuscripts. So the key of David and Hades. One solution is to do like Derrida did, life and death. So David represents life, and this is death. Not to have any space at all, but then you run into the problem, should they be on exactly the same level? Because you have this in most manuscripts and the early manuscripts. What I would do perhaps is to place this within parentheses, to mark it in only some late manuscripts. But on the other hand, it's a kind of marginalization. But I would still do this, the key of David, and then without a conjunction and. So you have the key of David, and then the reader has to figure it out, so to say. The key of David and of Hades, so to say. The key of David, Hades. So in the same way as Derrida announces seminars with the title Life, Death, the More. They were probably the students who were going to Derrida's seminary conference, and they were saying, did he forget something here? So here you had the same, they would not have a conjunction here, so it's a little bit awkward in one way, but that's perhaps what I would do, the key of David, Hades, and then they have to figure out. The parentheses, how would I philosophically justify the parentheses? Okay, one, because they are in few manuscripts, and two, the German philosopher Adorno, Theodor Adorno, he speaks about parentheses. They are like a enclave. Adorno doesn't like the parentheses because they create enclaves of thought, something separate. So in this sense, this is an enclave of death you would create within the text. But I admit that there is no smooth and easy solution how to edit the text. So I'm really struggling with this. Should I go all the way? The solution 2 is to go all the way, follow Derrida, and place them on equal level with a small. Oh, excuse me, it could fall down. So there are two solutions: use the parentheses or not to use it, and place them with only a little bit space there. And I give back to Hans. Perhaps he has he could resolve the problem for me.
Well, I don't want to further complicate things, but the saccades we were mentioning before, they show that reading is what something would call chaotic or quantum mechanical. And when we read, it's the saccades that take in, and they venture over the text. So they will bring in both at the same time if they are placed together, as Derrida suggests. We will read them simultaneously, but in time. These are called the saccades. And for me they were very telling that the idea that we read from left to right is not correct. We take in the whole text directly, the end points as well as the starting points, the alpha and the omega directly. That is reading. And that puts also Derrida's idea into another perspective by fixating on the trenches, saying life is better than death. We are doing something that our reading doesn't do, because when we read, we see them simultaneously almost, in time and in space differently, but at the same time. I don't know if that's a suggestion here, but we can think of it, and I will continue with the text for a bit, and then we go back to a summary, maybe 10-15 minutes before the end. Thank you very much, Kalle, very interesting. And it's a sort of a synchronicity here. When I was at the well of Paulus, a song came to my head, and then we just ventured into this with this chirality, and the song contained chirality, chire, hands, but it also contained kleivi, key. And the song said, the key is in your hand, your proper hand. This is an interesting little happening here and now. Today, the 6th of May in Jonsered. Rather interesting. It shows the decades of time as well. I will continue with the text from the 4th section. And for you, it is now on page 111, the last paragraph. Could you just check the time?
1 hour and 27, so you don't have so much time, but 15 minutes.
15 minutes, thank you. Before situating the problems that follow from this, let me clarify through a few references what I understand here by the textualization of biological object or referent. We're going into the idea that it's connected to something else by the sign, signifier, signified. As announced earlier, I will return for this to Jacob's The Logic of Living. Quite apart from all the questions that might be raised by the manner in which Jacob determines this genetic textuality, it is incontestable that he constitutes the genetic text, and that he is only describing. And this is what gives one the right to treat him as a representative or spokesperson for all modern genetics, a consensus, an approach that is today common in the field of genetics. And that's most definitely true. We mentioned a couple of times Jacques Monod, and he is one of the greatest dividers between life and death. We confirm this with regard to Jacob's notion of program and the word program. Here more broadly is what Jacob says about the general concept of the text, of which the program is a specification. Listen now, this is from Jacob. When heredity is described as a coded program in a sequence of chemical radicals, says Jacob, the contradiction between teleology and mechanism disappears. Later he writes, organs, cells, and molecules are thus united by a communication network. They constantly exchange signals and messages in the form of specific interactions between constituents. The flexibility of behavior depends on feedback loops, the rigidity of structures on the execution of a program rigorously prescribed. Heredity becomes the transfer of a message repeated from one generation to the next. The program of the structures to be produced are recorded in the nucleus of the egg. And important here, the contradiction between teleology and mechanism disappears. This is this opposition, which I would call before-after opposition. It has an effect, so to speak. There is more than just messages, communication, and transfer of information. One might, in fact, be tempted to say that such communication, such a language determined as communication, does not make a text. Also very important. So if you fixate on this, Derrida means it doesn't make a text. There is text only to the extent that there are instructional signs and archive, codes, and deciphering. Now, that is what was discovered in the course of what Jacob calls the fourth structure of order, to which modern genetics corresponds. The first order structure at the beginning of the 17th century corresponds to an arrangement of visible surfaces. The second order structure at the end of the 18th century to the organization that underlies organs and functions. And that was finally broken down into cells. The third order structure at the beginning of the 20th century corresponds to the discovery of chromosomes and genes, Francis Crick among others, which is the discovery upon which modern genetics lives, corresponds to the nuclei and the molecule. We enter the domain of Jacques Monod. These four structures shelter one another, inhabit one another, are nested in one another like Russian dolls, matrushka. To use the comparison that comes up frequently in this book, it being understood, as Jacob clearly notes, that the discovery of each new structure to which Jacob devotes each time a chapter in his book is not only an extension or a deepening of our knowledge, but also a structural transformation of knowledge itself. It's a structural transformation of knowledge itself. A new way of considering objects. You are looking at the Möbius strip all of a sudden from a different direction, and it changes. Moreover, for each order structure, one model, what Jacob calls a model, we will perhaps pose questions about this word later. Dominates. As if in order to last, says Jacob, a biological theory had to be based on a concrete model. What was discovered with the fourth order structure and the model corresponding to this discovery is the text. The fact that reproduction, an essential structure of the living, functions like a text. Reproduction, an essential structure of the living, functions like a text. Think of this one. The text is the model. It is rather the model of models. Indeed, Jacob mobilizes several analogies to describe the object of this discovery. But all of them involve regulation by something like a recorded and deciphered program. Writing, reading, codes, copies, and of course DNA. There is, for example, the analogy of the computer and the analogy of the factory. The analogy of the factory, in the case of bacteria, is eventually cast aside, and we will see why later. As for the analogy of the computer, it is dependent on the analogy of the text, which was actually what Francis Crick wrote. The latter does not depend on the discovery of a substance such as deoxyribonucleic acid, which is DNA. The existence of this acid has been known for nearly a century. It was known to exist in the nucleus of cells. Even in its overall composition was known, but its role and its molecular structure remained unknown. It was the discovery of its role and its structure that led us to speak of a text. It was chemical and crystallographic analysis that allowed us to know this structure and this role, to know what we were dealing with here, with a long polymer formed by the alignment of 4 subunits. These are repeated by millions and permeated along the chain. like, says Jacob, the letters of the alphabet in a text. It is the order of these 4 subunits that directs the order of the 20 subunits in proteins. I recommend you see them as letters. Everything then leads one to regard the sequence contained in the genetic material as a series of instructions specifying molecular structures, and hence the properties of the cell. To consider the plan of an organism as a message transmitted from generation to generation, to see the combinative system of the 4 chemical radicals as a system of numeration to the base 4. In short, everything urges one to compare the logic of heredity to that of a computer. Rarely has a model suggested by a particular epoch provided to be more faithful. Let me note in passing that this last sentence seemed to suggest that this accord is a stroke of chance, that this faithfulness in the application of a model imposed by an epoch to a given reality. This faithfulness of this adequation has something surprising about it, even though everything demonstrates, as Jacob's book itself does as well, that there is nothing fortuitous here. Well worth to be repeated. There's nothing fortuitous here. And as I said earlier, theology comes together with composition. It comes, in a way, hand in hand, like D and L.
1 hour 43.
I'll put a pause and I'm going to make a summary. So I will read again. When heredity is described as a coded program in a sequence of chemical radicals, the contradiction between teleology and mechanism disappears. And this is very close to the life-death slash is another way of explaining it. And it's actually the same. I see what Derrida is pointing to. Seeing the DNA as lifeless, as the mechanism, and that it comes before. And it sort of defines the present, that is me, my genes. Well, not my trousers genes, but my genetic uptake, the deoxynitric acid. Jacob and Derrida is pointing to that. To what will come, the DNA also creates. Something that more and more has been coming to fore in biology, and especially nuclear biology. Stephen Jay Gould, the famed geneticist and biologist, almost started with that it could be a teleology to what the organism or a will wanted it to become, and that the gene's structure after the present or the future And we know about the saccades, a good example here too. We cannot tell if it's reading what is to become, let's say me as a ready organism, and therefore the genes are going to be in a certain way, or the other way around. Life, death, deconstructs that. The unliving DNAs and what is me, an organism that is life, becomes together. It's very fitting that the DNA structure is a twisted structure. Left-handed, if I remember correctly. And the very spiraling is what's making it be what it is. Not only a textual line that starts to read at a certain point and then goes in one direction. No, this is being softened up here. It's becoming, why should an organism become in a certain way? What is the telos, the purpose? And I would call it force. And as we said before, Derrida often mentioned that the disturbance, or also the tremor, the Zittern, we had in the text of a recent term of an apocalyptic term recently adopted in philosophy by Jacques Derrida / Immanuel Kant. The tremor, the Zittern of the string is what makes it happen and creates both past and future at the same time. That's another take. Letting life and death stand next to each other makes them coexist, and thereby both life and death can exist by their own. But if we have this prioritization, death will definitely become a sort of supplement, and it will fester on life, having its parasitic stalemate tendency. This is biodeconstruction. Of course, we're going to go further into the text, but this is a sort of first take of the whole. Saccades defies after and before, they come at the same time. You order them. That's the role of the observer or the reader. And only then will the text speak, will produce an understanding or an organism. This is the process in a nutshell. I think my colleague Kalle has some comment.
Oj.
Oj, säger han.